The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers, laughter, and the melody of a live orchestra, but Isabella Hart felt like a ghost in the middle of it all. She sat quietly at her assigned table, her elegant navy gown perfectly tailored, her hair styled in soft waves, and her makeup flawless, but the gleaming wheelchair beneath her gown was the unspoken reason why she was alone. She was the CEO of one of the most successful tech firms in the city, a woman who commanded boardrooms and headlines, yet here at her best friend's wedding, surrounded by couples twirling across the dance floor, she felt small and out of place. She forced a smile whenever someone passed by and offered a polite nod, but her chest ached with an emptiness she couldn't shake. Her glass of champagne sat untouched, the bubbles rising and popping like fleeting reminders of joy she no longer felt entitled to. Since the accident 3 years ago, she had mastered the art of hiding her loneliness behind confidence and achievement, but weddings had a way of breaking through her armor, reminding her of everything she thought she had lost forever: companionship, intimacy, love. Tonight was no different. She told herself she didn't need it, that she was fine, that she was stronger than the ache in her heart, but deep down she longed for someone who could look past the chair and see her, the woman she used to be and the woman she still was. Across the room, Daniel Cole adjusted the slightly wrinkled sleeve of his tuxedo and tried to look like he belonged among the polished, wealthy crowd. He had come because his sister insisted he attend, she had even teased that he might meet someone, but Daniel knew better. He wasn't a rich man, not the kind who mingled effortlessly in places like this. He was a single dad, a mechanic by trade, a man with calloused hands and a heart that still carried the cracks of loss. His wife had died when their daughter Emma was still a baby, and since then, Daniel's world had revolved around keeping her safe, happy, and loved. Tonight, Emma had begged to come along, her bright eyes full of excitement at wearing a pink frilly dress and dancing like the princesses she adored, and Daniel hadn't been able to say no. As he stood by the dessert table watching her twirl in delight, she tugged at his sleeve and pointed. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is that pretty lady sitting all alone?" Daniel followed her gaze, and his eyes landed on Isabella. There was something in her expression, composed but fragile, as though she carried the weight of invisible chains, that stirred something deep inside him. Without overthinking, Daniel smoothed his hair nervously, straightened his jacket, and walked across the crowded room toward her table. Isabella looked up, startled, as his warm voice broke through her solitude. "Excuse me," he said gently, lowering his gaze to meet hers, "but my date just stood me up. Would you, maybe be mine tonight?" Isabella blinked in surprise, her mind scrambling to make sense of the unexpected invitation from the tall stranger standing before her, his kind eyes steady and genuine in a way she hadn't experienced in a very long time, and before she could form an excuse to politely decline, a small hand tugged at his sleeve and a little girl in a pink dress appeared at his side, her curls bouncing as she looked up at Isabella with wide, innocent eyes that sparkled under the soft glow of the chandeliers. "Please say yes," the child whispered, her voice so sweet and earnest that Isabella's heart softened against her will, and instead of retreating behind her usual wall of control, she found herself smiling for real, a smile that reached her eyes and made her look, for the first time that night, less like the untouchable CEO and more like a woman who simply wanted to belong. Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down beside her, making it clear he wasn't going to let her feel isolated, and the three of them began to talk as if they had known each other longer than a few minutes, Emma filling the conversation with innocent chatter while Daniel added warmth and humor, sharing light-hearted stories about being a single father, how Emma once painted the dog blue with her watercolors, how mornings were always chaos in their little home, and Isabella found herself laughing freely, the sound of her own laughter startling her because she couldn't remember the last time she had let it out without restraint. Her heart fluttered with an unfamiliar but welcome ease as she realized that Daniel was not looking at her with pity, not glancing nervously at the chair, not speaking to her as though she were fragile or broken, but rather as though she were simply a woman sitting beside him, deserving of attention and companionship. As the orchestra swelled into a romantic melody and couples drifted to the dance floor, Daniel turned to her with a smile that was both gentle and brave, and he asked, "Would you honor me with a dance?" The words hit her like a jolt, and instantly her throat tightened with the familiar sting of shame and longing, and she whispered, "I can't dance," her gaze dropping to her wheelchair as if it were a reminder of all she had lost, but Daniel didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead he pulled a chair right next to her, sat down, and extended his hand with a quiet determination that made her chest ache, saying softly, "Then I'll sit, and we'll dance like this." For a moment Isabella hesitated, torn between fear and hope, but then her fingers slid into his, and as he swayed his arm gently in rhythm with the music, she found herself swaying with him, her heart racing as the world around them blurred into nothing but the warmth of his presence and the sincerity in his eyes. In that simple, unorthodox dance, she wasn't a CEO, she wasn't a woman defined by her wheelchair. She was just Isabella, and for the first time in years, she felt seen, cherished, and alive. Later that evening, when the laughter and music inside the ballroom grew louder, Daniel suggested they step outside for some fresh air, and Isabella agreed, curious about this man who carried such an easy warmth. So they wheeled and walked into the garden where lanterns hung from the trees and the cool night breeze carried the scent of roses, creating a quiet haven away from the noise. They settled near a fountain, Emma curling up on a bench with her little shoes dangling while Daniel leaned back casually, his hands resting on his knees, and for a moment, Isabella simply watched him, noting how comfortable he seemed in silence, unlike most people who fidgeted around her as if they didn't know how to act. And it was that calmness that made her open her heart in a way she rarely dared. With her gaze lowered, she told him about the accident 3 years ago, how a reckless driver had changed her life in one violent instant, how she had spent months in hospitals and rehab, pushing her body to its limits only to face the crushing reality that she would never walk again, and how friends, colleagues, and even people she thought she loved had slowly drifted away, unable or unwilling to accept her new reality. Her voice trembled as she admitted that sometimes she felt invisible. Defined only by the chair, no longer seen as a woman who could be loved but as a symbol of tragedy and strength, two things that never quite filled the hollow ache of loneliness. She expected pity in his eyes, but instead she found something else, recognition, as though he understood all too well the pain of being left behind, and when he began to speak, she realized why. Daniel told her about losing his wife shortly after Emma's birth, how he had stood in a hospital room clutching a tiny baby while his world shattered around him, how he had stumbled through the fog of grief, trying to be both father and mother, protector and provider, often failing but never giving up because Emma needed him. He confessed that people often looked at him with sympathy too, as though being a widower defined everything about him, and he knew the weight of feeling broken, the fear of never being whole again, but he had learned to build a life anyway. "I know what it's like," he said quietly, his gaze steady on hers, "to think your pain makes you invisible, but it doesn't. You're not your wheelchair, Isabella. You're the strongest person in this garden, maybe in this whole wedding." His words lodged in her heart like a lifeline, and before she could respond, Emma, who had been drifting to sleep, shuffled over and climbed into Isabella's lap with the natural ease of a child who sensed kindness. Isabella froze for a moment, her arms instinctively wrapping around the little girl, and as Emma's head rested against her shoulder, a lump rose in her throat because she realized that for the first time since her accident, someone had chosen to sit with her, to stay, and a child had trusted her without hesitation, making her feel something she thought she had lost forever, belonging. When the last song faded and the newlyweds departed in a shower of laughter and sparklers, the guests slowly drifted away into the night, but Isabella lingered in the garden with Daniel and Emma, her heart caught in a tangle of fear and longing, afraid that the magic of the evening would dissolve the moment they parted ways. She had been given a glimpse of something she thought was gone forever, the simple comfort of being seen and cherished, and now she wasn't sure she was ready to let it go. Daniel seemed to notice her silence, the way her hands tightened on the armrests of her chair, and he leaned closer, his voice low but steady as he said, "You know, this doesn't have to end here. Emma and we'd like to see you again. Not the CEO everyone bows to, not the woman people whisper about because of the chair. Just you." The word struck something so deep in her that her breath caught, and for a long moment she could only stare at him, searching his face for any sign of pity or obligation, but all she found was sincerity, the kind of sincerity that terrified her because it meant he truly meant it. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice softer than she intended, and Daniel smiled, a quiet curve of his lips that carried both certainty and hope as he answered, "I've never been more sure of anything." Weeks later, Isabella found herself sitting beneath a tree at a small neighborhood park, a far cry from the glittering boardrooms and luxury events that usually filled her calendar, but as she watched Emma race across the grass with a toy airplane in her hands, her laughter echoing like sunlight in sound, Isabella realized she had never felt richer in her life. Daniel sat beside her on the bench, his arm resting casually along the back, his presence grounding her, and when his fingers brushed against hers and then intertwined without hesitation, she didn't pull away. Instead she leaned into him, her heart swelling with the quiet, steady realization that she was no longer invisible, no longer defined by her chair or her titles, but by the love and belonging she was finally allowing herself to embrace. In that moment, surrounded by the simple joy of a child's laughter and the warmth of a man who had seen past her armor, Isabella knew that what began as an unexpected invitation at a wedding had become the beginning of something far greater. A chance at love, a family she never thought she'd have, and the courage to believe that her life wasn't over but just beginning again in a different, more beautiful way. And as Daniel leaned closer, whispering something that made her laugh until her cheeks hurt, she realized that she hadn't just found a date that night, she had found a home.